Whew. Good evening. First words that I must share are of deep gratitude. To be here with all of you, and especially with the people who I hold so close to my heart. You have a lot of moments where you know, as in this work, where you're in front of a microphone or a podium, but to actually be surrounded in the spirit of ethics and in the spirit of love is a profound gift. I know that my dear friend Tiffany has to leave soon because she's a trip, so I'm going to call her out and just say that, as always, your words create worlds. And just immense gratitude to you. I would not be here without you. And us being together with all this is really profound. So thank you, and safe travels. Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. I'm so grateful to you, Mark, to the program in ethics, to the entire committee. It was an absolute treat and honor to hear about this award, and also just to be welcomed onto campus, to be surrounded by so many brilliant students, staff, faculty, thinkers. Already just today has been lit up, and now I have that work of trying to do the honor back and share. I do want to just say that one of the things that was most important to me, and just even seeing this specific award in Praxis is actually a very important word in my own life. As a college undergrad, I took a class called PACE, Programs in Awareness of Cross-Cultural Education. And it was a class taught through the Graduate School of Education, but it welcomed undergrads. It was fundamentally about facilitation, about social justice, and it was a class that you had to bring it. You had to bring your A game. But it was much more about what you would do out of the classroom and beyond the semester. And we learned the word praxis, thought and action as one, not just thought, not just action, but really bringing them together. And I think about my teachers in that class, one of them, Nathan Smith, and then all of the other teachers that I've had that have put praxis into action. And I just remember feeling like, you know, it's really important to read, but it's important to do. It's important to be present, but if you're going to be present, you must bring your full self. You must bring not just your full self, but all of your teachers, all of your learnings, all of your people, to make presence for those who can't be there with you, right? To balance thought and action. And it was a word that I didn't quite know how it would function in my life. And I've tried to think about it and reflect on it. So it feels like a moment of kismet to be brought here under that notion of praxis, to follow in the example of others who've received this award. I feel very honored and humbled, and if anything, nourished to keep doing this work. I also want to just say thank you in that spirit of the teachers who made me being here possible. And those are teachers at every level, from the youngest of age through the lifelong learning that I'm doing now. And teaching comes in many forms, and the best kind of teaching is one of mutual exchange, where you might have some information, but it's someone else who exchanges with you. That is really where knowledge exists in the relationship. I'm so grateful that my husband is here, Aaron, that my parents, Ruth and Barry, original teachers are here as well. And then just to be surrounded also with some remarkable people. You saw Tiffany, Nico, Yolanda, Jess. I'm here speaking on behalf of Monument Lab, but I'm able to be here because there are so many people working to make this work possible. And so in the spirit of that, I want to shout out the Monument Lab team and bring them in the room, and just think about the fact that this work really began as a classroom project and has spilled outward across the city, across the region, across this continent and beyond. And this work that we do is in public memory, and the burdens of public memory are there. There's trauma, there's wounds, there's scars, and yet you must find joy. You must find purpose, and you must find your people. And in that spirit, I can also say this is one of the most joyful groups. Because even in here, the moments that I'll talk a little bit about later, our work on the National Mall, we found a moment to pause time together, to bend time. And we say we like to put the fun in fundamental. We got to do this work, and we have to find our people. And I feel so grateful in thought and action that I have found my people. So I want to give immense appreciation and gratitude to the Monument Lab team. If you're wondering, while a few of them are sitting here, the rest are actually still in midair somewhere doing their thing. In this work, together, first as a classroom project, then as a passion project, there was no monument, there was no lab, but the work that we were doing was holding space, finding our people, making impact, and eventually, when we became a nonprofit, what we wanted to do is bring forward with us the best of our visions and values. In the last few months, we've came up with some mantras in a moment that we need affirmation and purpose. The world is hurting. We're filled with grief and loss. And what are our North Stars? How do we stay in it? How do we stay focused? How do we stay purposeful? Here are 6 mantras that I just want to put into the room here before sharing a little bit more about my work and the work of Monument Lab. The future of monuments is radically collective. The future of monuments holds space for all of our ancestors. The future of monuments reflects peace in place of war. The future of monuments knows no borders. The future of monuments speaks truth to power. And the future of monuments is changing. A word that has been on my mind a lot over the last few years is the word permanence. We are told, we are instructed, we are to assume that monuments are permanent, that they are eternal, sometimes that history is living inside of some statue. We know it's not, but we're trained to think in that way. For all of the ways that we hold and keep history, whether it is in family rituals, in the work that we do with our neighbors, whether it's photo albums, whether it is music, poetry, protest, we know actually that we hold history that is vulnerable, that is fragile, that must be held tightly, closely, and with care. So when I hear about the word permanence, I get it, because I feel it. My pocket has a camera in it, and then I'm walking around, whether it's on this campus or not, I'm taking pictures. I want to stop time, right? I want to hold that power. I want to make a mark. I want to register that I existed and that we existed. And yet I know that and do that in the space of a fragile world. And what I've been increasingly thinking about, and I've been writing a book for the last few years that I'm determined to unearth and get out, is a book called After Permanence. Is to think about if permanence is the goal, whether we're thinking about permanent public art, permanent settlement, permanent power, I believe we are endangering our long-term survival. And what if we thought about permanence, but we let it go, and we thought about other words? We thought about making an impact. We think about generational change. We think about legacy. We think about endurance. It's a scary thought that you and I, we will return to the seas, we will return to dust. But yet, how do we, in the spirit of our ancestors and those that come before us, who did a lot more with a lot less, make our imprint today? So I've been trying to think about, rather than holding up permanence as the ideal and the goal, but nonetheless understanding our longing for it, what else is possible? Because truthfully, I had a plastic bottle of water today. I'm sorry, I regret it, but truly, I tell you this because that plastic bottle will last longer than any monument you or I could create, right? So how do we shift our thinking about permanence and instead thinking about how we leave an imprint for one another? I want to take this opportunity to read a little bit from the book I'm working on, in part to hold myself accountable to make sure to write that book. And I want to just talk to you about a monument I stumbled upon. I have the great opportunity to travel across the country and the world to meet with people bringing about change and seeing sites. I want to share this one with you for a few moments. On a country road, the monument summoned me, not because it's grand or famous or belonged to me. I walked toward it because I could see it held stories. On a series of 5 upright granite tablets, I could make out a litany of places and names. The tablets were joined by flagpoles, spotlights, a pair of modest benches, and a grounded stone sign inscribed with a phalanx of military insignias. This local veterans memorial, outside of a Chamber of Commerce building, sat across the street from an antique market and a gas station. I was in Kent, Connecticut, a town of 3,000 people, home of the Scotticook Native Reservation, elite private prep schools, and a section of the Appalachian Trail. With the burden of grief and the toll of history, this could have been any number of cities or towns across this land. Standing in front of this monument, I paused to read the words set in stone, to listen to the surrounding buzz and bristle of sounds of life, to run my hands across the surface, looking for others' fingerprints and leave my own. I look for the ways that change lives here. Despite the perception of stillness and permanence, our sites of memory hum with energy. I want to know where these particular stories begin and end. I try to learn from a monument's design, its phrasings, but also its blank spaces, its placards and contexts, its presences and absences. Up close in Kent, as I have in many other places with these similarly crafted, enduring materials, I saw my reflection in the polished stone. In Kent, as many places in the United States and its territories, veterans' memorials recall the names of local residents, often from widely recognized wars from the previous century, World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. The list of residents' names listed under each conflict feel both quotidian and heavy. The number of names, small in comparison to larger national war memorials, feel like a difficult metric from which to measure loss and grief. No matter how many names are listed, traced, recited, so many people, unnamed, in the painful, rippling concentric circles of entanglement from conflict and conquest are indicated here. Alongside the headings of those well-documented wars, here I saw other named conflict zones recognized that are often, and as of yet, rarely depicted in our commemorative landscape. They were grouped in ways that felt more distinct, a constellation of contemporary conflict and loss. Lebanon and Grenada, Panama, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Persian Gulf era, Iraq freedom, enduring freedom, Afghanistan, and Gulf War on terrorism. Together, a laundry list of places, of missions, and U.S.-named conflicts that included no dates, maps, or rationales. They're bonded by the virtues of time and circumstance, space and longing, a still-emerging cartography of American empire and grief. But beyond this grouping, another inscription on its own on a neighboring tablet jumped out and hailed my recognition. Peacetime/other conflicts. I experienced this inscription as nothing short of a revelation and a quiet premonition. On my travels to sites of memory across the world for decades, I've never seen this anywhere else. A flood of questions rushed to the forefront of my thoughts. Where is peacetime? When is peacetime? What other conflicts? That was the copy editor in me. Asking, what does the slash signify beyond this pairing? What does peacetime/other conflicts include, and what does it obscure? Under this heading, amidst a pomp of memorialization, I saw an ambivalence that was laid bare, an uncertainty of where peace and war begin and end. Under this sign of peacetime and other conflicts, I read fewer than 10 names of people who had been inscribed there. I wondered, who were they? Where did they live? Whose lives did they touch? I thought of these individuals, and then I thought about the people who decided to include them and name them here. Where do these people belong other than on this stone? My gaze moved to the empty space, alongside and beneath these names, the largest blank space on any spot in this memorial. It made me wonder who was next and where this memorial begins and ends. I found out later that in several years prior to my visit, this memorial had undergone a renovation. The original tablets that were included in those legacy wars were rearranged, and another structure was added to accommodate casualties from more recent battles. Even the memorial's order of linear time was disrupted for its new design. I was reminded that we are constantly making space for our grief, whether we acknowledge it or not. But even if I never learned of the renovation and the backstory, that day on that Country Roads Memorial, I found something that I was seeking, a signpost on a journey across the uneven history of this country and this world, where change is elusive, but it's constant, where we are connected across space and time in more ways than we often acknowledge, where we forego the aura of permanence in our public monuments because we are seeking something else. That is part of thinking that I'm trying to kind of bring forward and bring out a bit of experience that has really informed the work of Monument Lab over the years. And I think part of this really comes out of the idea of something I used to think, that an assumption. There must be some agency out there that's in charge of all of our monuments. That if you're like, okay, we need a monument, or no, we got to take this one down, or wait, I really want to know who paid for this monument. I really want to know why it exists. I will tell you, you're reasonable to think it, but like me, I had to learn that's not the case. We have lots of stewards and holders of history. They're at federal, state, local, tribal, community, institutional, university, and college levels. They constitute, at best, a patchwork, a quilt of American memory, but truly that also marks between the stitches the fault lines of the way that we remember, the hierarchies of who gets to tell the stories and whose stories don't get the resources and spotlights under that framework of monuments. You see, there is nothing that is inherently a monument. There are things that we call monuments. There are things that we resource as monuments. There's things that we actually put physical spotlights on. If you have the time, the money, and the power, you build monuments that are important to you and reflect your place. If you don't have the time, the money, or the official power, you have power nonetheless. You build your own monument, or you gather around one that exists. When we at Monument Lab saw that not only was there not one definition of monument, you see, because maybe we're thinking, talked to great students here at Villanova today who shared with me, some of whom are here, their definitions of monument. Thank you for that. And it was a great class of over a dozen students with even more opinions on what a monument could be. Because you see, monuments also could be archaeological sites. They can be traces. They can be historic homes. They can sometimes speak to the unintentional monuments, the shuttered school or factory. Sometimes it's actually things that are monumental, like poetry, protest, sound, projection. So at Monument Lab, we came up with a definition because what we sensed from people that we talked to was that monument was a way to talk about past, present, and future at one time. So we came up with the idea, with the definition that monuments are statements of presence and power in public. This spirit of not just definition, but of mutual exchange has guided Monument Lab from the beginning. We started building prototype monuments in public spaces, and having them joined by learning labs with our students, with social workers, with public historians, people who sometimes spoke at podiums like this, but they often moved off those podiums and found each other in the street, in the city square. This was our first project in 2015 in the courtyard of Philadelphia City Hall, where the monument wasn't meant to be permanent or universal, it was meant to be central. It was meant to be a stage, a convening space, an architectural meeting ground. In other works that we have done, we've worked with artists, here like Karen Olivier, who covered a monument in a mirror. We asked how monuments reflect us. Well, we made that literal. And we get to work with artists who are experimenting with the monuments we've inherited and the ones that have yet to emerge. We were able to curate the first public art exhibition on the National Mall. Here, an installation by the artist Wendy Red Star on an island dedicated to the signers of the Declaration of Independence, with a piece that recalls Wendy Red Star's own Crow heritage, the Apsaloga people, and included the names of all of the representatives from her tribe who signed treaties with the US government, here in an epic and iconic view. These prototypes sometimes last in a public space for a matter of weeks or months. Sometimes they go into long-standing collections, I won't use that P word, where they endure and are visible, but they also spur other kinds of change. We have started working on legacy monuments. Here is one that will just be installed around this time next year down the road, down Lancaster Avenue at Bryn Mawr College. We've been working with the president's office, with students, with faculty, with staff, and alums on a monument that recognizes legacies of exclusion, past and present. The college, that has involved a 5-year effort. We're about 3 years in. Here, the work by Nikisha Durrett, Don't Forget to Remember Me, is an honor and a nod to the maids and porters who served the college at a moment while it was a beacon for women's education that was for women who were white and not Jewish. And this is honoring the maids and porters, many of whom were Black, who served at the college and whose work helped build the institution. I'll talk a little bit more about the audit, but we do field building and narrative change to understand the monuments we've inherited and to really ask questions of them. Because look, for every monument that is in the news, that's under the spotlight, there's hundreds of them that are kind of like hiding in plain sight. And so we wanted to understand that. We also do work with locally rooted commemorative groups, balancing local knowledge and expertise with coalition across the country. Our regeneration effort has subgranted now $2 million to 20 teams across the country, including our very own Yolanda Wisher's Consensus here in Philadelphia, a nod to Black women and femme poets who've made their imprint on our historic city in profound ways. We like to theorize public space in public space. And while I love being here with you in this great institution of higher learning, I'm more of a feral academic. I love being outside. And in these kind of spaces, we like to hire students, artist educators, to just ask questions. It's amazing what artists, young people, and educators can do to cut through that skepticism that we have and actually invite from people we really want to know. We ask questions that don't have an easy answer, but they're meant to have a multitude of answers. People are often asked, while we are data heads and wonks, we like people to handwrite. This is kind of our ingredient because it's a tool that has a low barrier for entrance. And we often turn this either into data or reports. Some of these are ideas that are tangible, that are practical, that are pragmatic, but others speak to the ethical, the moral, the visionary values of people who understand their own journey and their own path in public space better than we could ever know or tell them. A lot of this work, as you've been hearing me say, has to do with presence and absence. Because for every monument that you see upright, as my colleague and co-founder Ken Lum would say, there's a lot of people and a lot of stories that are absent. In fact, if you're ever somewhere and someone tells you this is the only story, the single story of this place, please ask, say more, do more, because there's no place with a single story. What we strive to do and what our artists have really taught us is to balance presence and absence. Who is making a monument, but whose voice hasn't been heard? What story is there, but what story is not only not present, but maybe is lost to us in history? Not all history is written in stone. Not all history lives in archives. A lot of times it gets carried with us across strenuous and tenuous circumstances. This is really influenced by a lot of people, but one person who I try to acknowledge in as many of my talks is the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, who in the late 1980s, while writing her novel Beloved, about the haunts of slavery in this country, said the following: "There is no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presences of or recollect the absences of enslaved people. There's no suitable memorial or plaque or wreath or wall or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower, there's no small bench by the road, and because such a place does not exist, the book had to." Now, to be very clear, there are sites since this, set in the late 1980s, that have emerged. The President's House here on Independence Mall. There's major sites. But to be very clear, there is no national memorial or monument to the legacy of enslavement in this country. I spent my time writing a dissertation about Americans in Berlin, and you can't imagine having a city with memorials that don't honor the profound trauma and death of the Holocaust. So I think about Toni Morrison as one of those people whose footsteps we proceed in, who said, look, actually, she just went ahead and named all these different memorials from the Grand to the Quotidian, but said, nonetheless, the book will do this. One point that I want to bring up in the spirit of what comes after permanence, meaning when we expand our vocabulary and mindsets, is the Toni Morrison Society has, for the last several decades, been dedicating benches by the road, places of racial trauma and transformation. Toni Morrison, during her life, was able to be there for certain dedications. At her funeral, a memorial service at the Schomburg, there was a bench on the stage. And to just think about what we do when we pick up the legacy from those that come before us. We got to work with the tools and the imprints and the traces they gave us, but to find ways to balance presence and absence. That, to me, is full history. I want to go back to the monument audit. And this was a project that was sponsored and in partnership with the Mellon Foundation. This was done by a huge team of people. It was led by Sue Mobley, Lori Allen, and myself, a team of 30 people that never got to sit in the same room. That meant we had a lot of Zooming, but also we never got our ultimate party. So just think about this and raise one to this group of remarkable folks who, during the pandemic, spent a year scouring hundreds of thousands of historic records. There is no data in a file that's like the monuments. No, we had to pull from all kinds of other data on cemeteries, on public roads, on public property, parsing it out from federal, state, local sources. You ever tried to combine two spreadsheets? Well, try to put 500,000 records into one. We did not seek to count everything that could ever be called a monument in America. It would be too hard. Do you call the Awakening, aka I think is known as the Oreos or the cookies on this campus, do you call that a monument? Well, we could sit here and debate it for years, or we could actually work with the data that exists. So we found 48,178 conventional monuments in federal, state, local, tribal, institutional records. It included every U.S. state, every territory, numerous tribal nations. Again, this is not about everything that could ever be called a monument, but this is instead the first study that took a look panoramically, not just one statue at a time, one boulevard at a time, but how we have memorialized over generations and generations. I'm going to read quickly to you the 4 key findings. You can read this on our website. You can order a copy or download a free one. But here are the key findings. And as I read this, I want you to think about how this compares to your communities, your towns that you're from. Monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest, and the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. I'll go into 2 in detail. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. You all probably already knew this, right? But let's talk through it. We took a look at the top 50 figures who have monuments dedicated to them in this country to get a sense, again, of how we memorialize. Of this top 50, just some overviews. 1 is that 11 were U.S. presidents, 12 were U.S. generals. We did not count people who only served as Confederate generals. They sought to dismantle this country. Over, I think, 76% were landowners. 40% were born into wealth. Half of the top 50 claimed ownership over other people. And 44 of the top 50, from today's standards, we would think of as white men. So first of all, just to note, women are grossly underrepresented in the monument landscape. There are 3 women in the top 50. The most monumentalized woman in America at the time of this study was close. Sacagawea is one. No, it's Joan of Arc, St. Joan. Yeah. So you got Joan of Arc, number 1. Joan of Arc downtown, right, by the Art Museum, and Harriet Tubman. There were more Confederates than Black Americans in the top 50. There are no US-born Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, or self-identified LGBTQ plus people in the top 50. And let's be clear, we know they make history too. We make history too. This tells us not just about what one city or town is up to. This tells us how historically, over time, this is who is getting the monument spotlight. So to this final note, the story of the United States as told by our current monument landscape misrepresents our history. I will say there was a lot of information in the audit that are things that we knew, but we were affirmed with data. This is one that blew me away. So of close to 6,000 Civil War monuments mentioned in our audit, 1% mention slavery. The Civil War was fought over slavery, full stop. This just means the word slavery was in the metadata, the records kept about monuments, maybe on the plaque, maybe the title. It's not necessarily about the stories of self-emancipated Black folks who fought for their freedom, the legacies of slavery that live with us till today. In fact, we found that fewer than 1% of all of the monuments mention or reference civil rights or abolition. But when we look at Confederate monuments, 1,690, only 3% mention defeat. And I can tell you from my travels, I see words like statesman, loyal, patriot, more than I see the word defeat. When we think about, in this country, our legacies of indigeneity, pioneer monuments, close to 1,000, 916. 15% also acknowledge Native American, Indian, or indigenous in their language. That's not even counting the pejorative language that also is in the archives. We also know that over half of pioneer monuments were dedicated after 1930. So this is after a period of prolonged armed battle with Native nations who signed treaties with the US government and were violently dispossessed from their land. I want to say this, and I want to put this in a context of, look, I've seen when a new monument is added to a community or a toxic one is taken out of public view. And I want to tell you how profound and prolific that can be. It is profound. And we can't just complete the monument landscape with a few additions. If we do not respond to the erasure and the lies, we are doomed to repeat. And in fact, there's actually so much that we can learn from our past that really would be helpful for today. You'd wonder, we've been through a pandemic, we're still living through a pandemic. You would think, I get calls all the time from journalists, because you would think like, well, what's the COVID memorial gonna be? I'm like, let me tell you, if you wanna look at other public health crises from the influenza in 1918 to the AIDS crisis, what you're gonna find is communities holding memory in their own ways. So what I want us to understand is not just this question, which we often hear of, should we keep all the monuments? Should we tear them all down? It's not a zero-sum game. We have to think about what vision and what values we want to leave for our next generation. We have to think about what tools we need. We are facing a moment of, in one hand, a profound reawakening around history. Like, we have more tools that can tell history, that can bring it together, from social media to new libraries to the ways that new voices, especially those that have been marginalized for far too long, are rising to places of presence and power. But let's be really clear, we are living in a scary, repressive moment where to just teach the full history of this country is under attack. And I want to just be really clear, when you hear someone say, well, what about history? Let's just remember, history doesn't happen because some dude rolled into town on a horse, looked off into the distance. History lives with people. It lives with us. And I'm going to tell you that when you live with the full history, not the cliff notes, not the TLDR, right? The real history, what you'll find is something that is so beautiful, so profound, it tells us how we will survive together. And so what I want us to do in big and small ways every day is to really think about what we are doing to uphold history that lives with us. All of us can do it. I know it feels daunting, but all of us can do it. I want to close quickly with a project that Monument Lab is working on. Do I have a few more minutes to close? Okay. I want to talk about the power of not just telling the full history, but the power of art to lead us through the most challenging and yet the most nourishing possibilities we can imagine. Here's the artist Sonia Clark, standing in front of a wall at Philadelphia's Declaration House. The Declaration House is at 7th and Market Streets, and it is the place on which Thomas Jefferson and Robert Hemings spent the summer of 1776. Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of our Declaration of Independence, was 33 years old at the time. And if you've ever been to 7th and Market, it's like the middle of the city, one of the most trafficked streets in Philadelphia. At that time, it was on the outskirts of Philadelphia. He rented a home from the Graff family, who were bricklayers, and rented a room, colonial Airbnb, if you want to picture it. And it was there that he met with people who we call founders of this country. At the same time, Robert Hemings, 14 years old and enslaved, brought up by Jefferson from Monticello, where his family was enslaved. Robert Hemings was the biological half-brother of Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha. He was 14 years old at the time. There are countless records of what Thomas Jefferson did, said, met with. Robert Hemings is someone that we don't have a lot of information about. We think about this site. They stayed in the Graff House. It eventually was demolished. It became eventually a bank designed by Philadelphia great architect Frank Furness. That was demolished. It became Tom Thumb, a diner. That was demolished. And in 1975, for the bicentennial of this country, the National Park Service rebuilt a replica house of the Graff House, calling it Declaration House, and then also built on an additional wing. 7th Street, by the way, is fascinating in Philadelphia because you have all these civic institutions. You have National Park, you have the Free Library, you have WHYY, the house that Terry Gross built. You have, right? You also have a bankrupt Philadelphia History Museum. You have a federal prison. You have the former site of the police headquarters. You can go on and on. You have a microcosm of not just our city's layers, but all cities. So this site has captivated us. But that idea of what do we do with the legacy of Robert Hemings? What if we moved Robert Hemings more to the center of the story? Not taking away anyone else who's been at the center over and over. We just want to know what happens when Robert Hemings becomes the focus. We met Sonia Clark years ago as a brilliant artist whose work has been shown in some of America's finest institutions because she wanted historic dust. She was doing a performance at the Fabric Workshop about the Declaration of Independence, and she said to me when I met her, "I'm looking for historic dust, and certain historic sites will not give it to me." She was revealing the words of the Declaration of Independence while also conjuring previous images from Gordon Parks, the so-called American Gothic. And we were able to get her historic dust from the Declaration House and Independence Hall. And it started this conversation about the life and story of the Declaration. So Sonia said, "I'm thinking about this site, but I'm really thinking about the legacy of what it tells and this question of what to do with the absence of Robert Hemings' likeness." And she said to me, to our team, to Yolanda, to Anna Kesson, one of our other curators, maybe we don't have any images as we think of them, but you know where the likeness of someone lives? It's in the eye. She said, "I want to meet the descendants of Robert Hemings, and I want to photograph them, and I want to see their eyes. And when we went to Monticello, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and met the Getting Word Project, a group at Monticello who bring together the oral history of the over 600 people who were enslaved at Monticello and their descendants. They said, we want to do this project, but we don't just invite one line. All the families are so close, both by biology and kin. Could you invite all of the descendants? As my husband told me when I was like, couldn't sleep the night was there, and he was like, wow, you went to Monticello looking for Robert Hemings, but you found America. And what we did is document people's eyes who are descendants, people who are as young as elementary school, as old as our grandparents and elders. And Sonia asked them to look into the camera, to see not only their own reflection, but to see all those who came before them. What she wants us to do is understand not just how we carry on lineage, but she also wants to remind us not only are these Robert Hemings descendants, these are Thomas Jefferson's too. Because Thomas Jefferson also is embroiled in this DNA. In fact, as we learned from our trip there, Thomas Jefferson had white grandsons who fought for the Confederacy. He had black grandsons that fought for the Union. All but one of his white granddaughters talked to their brothers and husbands and said, we don't believe what you're doing is along the lines of our family, right? So you're just thinking when you're doing this, you are deep in the hardest questions we face as a nation. What Sonia wants to do is bring this to life in the windows of the Declaration House. I think, Helen, as you said tonight at dinner, the eyes are the window to the soul. And our hope is that this stands as a reminder for us to bear witness, for us to think about the ways of what we can see and what we cannot see, what we are called to in praxis, in thought and action, for ourselves and for one another, how we must live out that credo, that monuments must change. On that note, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question, and also today for your amazing students and our dialogue. Both. So I think we see artists who utilize traditional materials like bronze, marble, stone in really creative ways. They want to test form, they want to test and push that material, or maybe they actually just want to represent people or groups of people that don't often get the pedestal. We also have artists who say, you know what? I want to play around with material. I want to actually cut to the chase. I want to cut to the core of how people remember. So just in a few weeks, we're opening up a show at Grounds for Sculpture, not too far from here, up in Hamilton, New Jersey, curated by our longtime curator, Patricia Kim. It's called Slow Motion. And it's a show of monuments that are meant to, whether fast or slow, change over time. And I would just say the backdrop of this, and we put this in our audit, any monument that you're thinking about that we often put that P word permanent with, bronze. Well, bronze changes over time. What about marble? Well, acid rain changes it. Well, we had monuments that we used to make of lead in this country, and squirrels would eat them, and they would be stolen and fall apart, right? There are great monumental structures made of wood, but even that wood needs to be cared for. So I think every monument you see that is not in shambles, in crumbled, has been preserved. So it's not quite permanent, but it might be enduring in time scales that are different. So we have artists who are working with aluminum plucked from the supply chain and the kind of circular economy. An artist who recognizes that he's built a monolith. This is Billy DeFalla of Rare. And he's going to, rather than sell this as a sculpture on the art market, he's going to put it back into the aluminum supply chain and utilize that to make and remake art. It's almost like having a bronze piece that you melt and remake. We have another artist, Colette Fu, who's making a piece called Noodle Mountain that honors the legacy of Chinese American laborers, and it's a massive paper book that you crank and move. This is not something that could live outside very well, but this is luckily in an indoor space. So I think what we get to see, thankfully, is that artists are often ahead of the curve where they're playing around. It's not either or. They're actually figuring out what is the right material to respond to this story, this moment, this group of people. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
So in your response to that, I was also thinking, I'm an English teacher. I just teach up the road at high school students.
Great.
And one of the documents that I have my students read is the Carolyn Randall Williams op-ed, My Body with Confederate Monuments, which is the British Democratic title.
That's right.
It made me think of your very first slide, the North Star slide, where you talked about the all. The second one in was about the all. How much of, you kind of repeated this a little bit, but I want you to think about, do we need to have active judgment of some of the things that had been done in the past in order to kind of correct your fourth point about, the errors, and also how that seems to be in conflict with the all.
Yeah. So I think, I appreciate your question, and my quick answer is yes. I do think that there are monuments that should be removed. If you have a monument to a person who sought to destroy the country, but their statue is out front of a courthouse or a public school or a library, or gets federal, state, or local tax dollars to keep it shining, I don't think that that is the place for it. But I think there are a lot of other places for them. And I think it's actually up to every community to figure that out. There's no one single answer. So I think there's a few ways to approach it. One is, one thing we could take a look at is if a given historical figure is like kind of under the, let's say, the political heat, maybe we could just start to just ask questions like, how many statues of that person or other commemorative structures are operating in that place or other places? Is that the only place for them? Is there something historic to that location? Is there room on or next to that monument for additional stories? Right? Because I think what you'll find is a range of outcomes. You'll find places like a Robert E. Lee statue that used to be on Monument Avenue in Richmond that was one of the first acts of the post-Reconstruction all-white Virginia State Assembly, was to create that and to make it a few inches taller than the George Washington at the State House. That one, I think it's time to go, right? Where it could go is a very interesting question. I think there are contexts that I've seen places where cemeteries, for example, or museums are incredibly appropriate or powerful places to put monuments that have been removed. There's others that reify. Like if a museum asks us what we should do with a monument, what I would say is never put it back up right, leave it in as much of the condition as you have, and rather than putting all the resources into conserving it, like put that money into education. Like the money, and let it decay, let it fall apart. It might take 100 years, but allow people to touch it and bring it back to scale. The one last thing I will say that was eye-opening from the audit, I am fascinated by empty pedestals around this country. I go find them if I'm in a city, and I was pretty sure before the audit that there must be a lot of our if I followed media reports and questions I get from audiences, I would often hear about the toppled monuments. In our audit, when we looked at that period of 2020 and 2021, we found that over 99% of monuments were not removed that year. Most were actually still in situ. That gave a different perspective to me, which is, I think that we actually should have a more openness to adaptive reuse with monuments and changes in monuments because it happens all the time. I would like, if we're gonna be sensitive about which monuments to keep and to remove, I wanna add more options than that And I want to add not only what we could add to that site, but I want us to have the same sensitivity to holding on to history as with statues as we do with immigrant and Black neighborhoods that are constantly demolished and under threat, cultural artifacts that are under-resourced, right? And so I think that my hope is that this kind of work, and your great question, help us think about the criteria under which we protect our monuments, where we put our resources, and also how we allow more change, because actually when you add more to a statue, when you add more to a memorial park, you actually are bringing history to life in profound ways, not shutting it down, but opening it up. Yeah, thank you. There's a question in the back. Hi. Mm. That's right. Yeah. I did. I appreciate it. Well, you said a lot that's really important, both about this question in the classroom, but also about what it means to encounter a history that puts you down versus a history that builds you up. And I think my hope is that we have more history in public that builds us, all of us up, not just some of us up, right? I was just reminded, just a few weeks ago, on a very cold, rainy Saturday, I was able to go to the Statue of Liberty for the first time, and a big shout out to our senior curator, Yolanda Wisher, who braved every raindrop with me to go. And seeing it in person for the first time was really inspiring. And just the reminder of the Statue of Liberty for all kinds of bits about it, like we're often told the poem by Emma Lazarus, like, bring me your tired, your huddled masses. Like, I was expecting it to be like huge, but it was this tiny little plaque, but it's the poem heard around the world, but it wasn't a part of the original dedication. In fact, it was added by, after the poet Emma Lazarus died, by one of her friends. At a moment, the Statue of Liberty was, I'm being a little bit flippant here, but also based on, some archives, like seen as a kind of failed lighthouse in the city. And now we can't separate it as that symbol. But the other thing that really jumped out was, and maybe some of you have seen this or know about this, the broken chains at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Because the Statue of Liberty, in celebrating these ideals of freedom and liberty and equality, was a gift in the wake of the Civil War about emancipation, abolition. And I'm really inspired by the ways that it's a symbol around immigration, but I just wonder, and I feel like, Yolanda, you were talking a bit about this, like, would it have meant as a young person, let alone as an educator, to be able to have understood that the torch, and it is joined by the broken chain? Just what that would have meant if that's Americana, right? That should be Americana. That actually tells us so much about ourselves. I think that the work that you share about what's happening in every classroom and in and outside of every classroom is so fundamental. And what I would say is something that we have learned over time is that, like, you know what's a unit you can do is just go to a monument and ask questions of it. You can play the game of maybe it's great to get the background, but even asking questions, approaching it, not just looking up in reverence or being cold, but like go up and touch and feel and question. If you want to know history, you don't go to a monument. That's not what you do. You read a book, you talk to a librarian, you talk to your teachers. The monument is part of it, but I think then what if we flipped it and made those monuments key? The last thing I'll say, which a colleague of ours, Kenyansola Anafuashe, who was an intern and a youth fellow of ours, helped create the Monument Lab field trip. It's free on our website. It looks like it's for middle schoolers, but we've had like graduate programs and all ages use it. And there's a page called Expanding the Pedestal. And it's just like, find a monument to a single person somewhere. And off of that, here are all the names of people you imagine that made it possible for them to be recognized historically. And we wanted that because we were like, well, we want someone to look at a Thomas Jefferson monument or a Harriet Tubman monument and be able to ask that question about collectivity. And expanding the pedestal was profound for us. And now it's changed the way I look at a single figure. I'm always wondering who else is there. And I think that's the power of student and educator learning, is just by asking sometimes the most basic surface level questions, that's how you get to the depths. That's how you open up possibility. So I appreciate your question deeply. Yeah, thank you. Now we meet.
You know, as you were looking it up, I was just thinking about, we put names on colleges, on buildings, halls, and
Yeah.
hospitals, and of course, those send very important messages to students. And I was wondering whether or not, in your audit, you were looking at those names from a national perspective, and what you learned in terms of the composition, the graphics, the message that they
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I'll give you a short and then a slightly longer answer to close for the night. We didn't do that because if we did, we'd still be at the audit and I wouldn't be here. And I'll say that in part because there are some great colleagues that MIT Data and Feminism Lab has been doing work on street names and parks. Our colleague Sue Mobley was co-chair of the New Orleans Street Renaming Commission, and what we saw from projects that were bigger than a municipality or a campus is that it is debilitating. If you see Forest Road, is that Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general and grand, wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who is honored throughout this country? Or is that a forest with trees? So I think what we decided to do was focus on conventional monuments, but try to find colleagues who are doing this work. And what I will say is, I have been at campuses who do an audit. Sometimes it's a classroom project, other times it's from the administration. My understanding is the name Molden here carries important weight, which is a different kind of naming, right? As I've understood that it was intended to honor a formerly enslaved person who was key to the development of this campus and its land and its stewardship, but the role of that person was kind of lost to history, but now has been catalytic. I believe we're joined here by a Molden professor, as well as the program, and I'm just hearing that for the first time. There's others who know this a lot better. So what I would say is, that was the first exercise I did with my students back in 2012, was we went around campus and we did an exercise first. Just picture what would happen if you could blink a light switch and all the names disappeared for a second. How much negative space would you have? And then if you flicked it back on, how do you make sure names stay relevant and grow? And when I've heard from students especially, they say, yeah, okay, we know it was the rich person, they put the name on, or this was the powerful person and the important person, but like, what if we had spaces where the names changed? Or in fact, what if we focused on like campus activism or legacy and we made that part of it? And maybe, no, it's not gonna rise to the level of a building, but I wanna find their name. I think there's something really profound about stumbling upon a name We walk by and pass by them every day, but I think there's something powerful about bringing forward the names that are on the buildings, on the classrooms, on the plaques, and asking ourselves, what would it take for more names or other names to be added, and how do you make that layered composition the way that we bring history forward with us? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.